Hey guys, tonight you're not stepping into the sunlit prairie world that Laura Ingalls Wilder chose to show you in her beloved books. You're walking into a chapter that was deliberately erased, a period so painful and humiliating that it was buried in silence for generations, and you're arriving on a spring evening in 1877 in a shabby hotel in Burr Oak, Iowa, where the smell of unwashed travellers and boiled cabbage hangs in the air like a confession of failure, where your mother Caroline is 9 months pregnant and exhausted beyond words, and where the ghost of a dead baby boy still haunts every corner of the cramped rooms your family now calls home. Settle in. Get comfortable. Because you are about to witness the birth of Grace Pearl Ingalls, the forgotten sister, the replacement child, the baby born into a family that was drowning in grief and poverty and shame, and you need to understand that everything about her life, every choice she would make, every loss she would endure, began here, in this hidden year that the famous books pretended never happened. You are Caroline Ingalls, and you are 37 years old. Your hands are red and raw from scrubbing floors in the Masters Hotel, a rambling 2-story building that serves as an inn for travellers passing through this small Iowa town. Your back aches from hauling water up the stairs to fill the wash basins in the guest rooms. Your feet throb in shoes that are falling apart because you cannot afford to replace them. You are 9 months pregnant and you are still working, still cleaning, still cooking meals for strangers who pay your husband William Masters a few dollars for a night's lodging and a plate of food. Because if you stop working, if you take even a day to rest, the family might not have enough money to buy flour for next week's bread. Your husband Charles is outside tending to the horses in the stable behind the hotel. He works for Masters too, doing odd jobs and manual labour, earning just enough to keep the family fed but not enough to save, not enough to buy land, not enough to escape this place. He is 41 years old, and the light has gone out of his eyes. The man who once played the fiddle and sang songs and dreamed of building a better life for his daughters now moves through the days in silence, his shoulders bent under the weight of failure. You have 3 daughters. Mary is 12, blind now for nearly 2 years, her world reduced to darkness and the touch of her hands and the sound of voices. Laura is 10, fierce and watchful, already carrying more responsibility than any child should bear. Carrie is 6, quiet and small for her age, the child who learned early that making noise or causing trouble only adds to the burden. They sleep in a narrow room upstairs, sharing a single bed because there is no space for anything else, and they do not complain because they have learned that complaining changes nothing. And then there is the one who is not here, Charles Frederick Ingalls, called Freddie, your only son, born in November of 1875, dead in August of 1876, 9 months old, buried in a grave in Walnut Grove, Minnesota. The town you fled because staying there meant walking past his grave every day and being reminded that you could not save him. The doctors said it was cholera, or perhaps it was something else, one of the 100 nameless illnesses that kill babies on the frontier with casual regularity. It does not matter what killed him. What matters is that he died, and you held his small body as it grew cold, and you buried him in soil that was hard and dry, and you left him there when the family packed up and moved to Iowa, because Charles could not make the farm work, and the creditors were circling, and there was no money left to try again. You are pregnant again, and you do not want to be. You know this is a terrible thing to think, a sinful thing, the kind of thought that a good Christian woman should never allow into her mind. But the truth sits in your chest like a stone. You do not want another baby. You do not want another mouth to feed, another fragile life that could be snatched away by illness or accident, or the cruel randomness of a world that takes more than it gives. You do not want to love another child and risk the agony of losing them. But the baby is coming whether you want it or not. Your body has made this decision without consulting your mind or your heart, and so you scrub floors and you cook meals and you wait for the pain to begin, and you try not to think about Freddie, about his soft hair and his tiny fingers and the way he used to look at you with complete trust, as if you were the centre of his universe and nothing bad could ever happen as long as you were near. The pain starts just after sunset on May 23rd. It is not the first time you have done this, not the 5th time, and your body knows what to do even if your heart is not in it. You tell Charles. He nods, his face blank, and goes to fetch the neighbour woman who serves as a midwife in this town. You send the girls downstairs to sit in the hotel kitchen, away from what is about to happen, and then you lie down on the narrow bed in the room you share with Charles, and you wait for the child to be born, and you feel nothing, not hope, not joy, not the anticipation that should accompany the arrival of a new life. You feel only exhaustion and a distant, detached awareness that in a few hours you will have another daughter, and the daughter will need to be fed and clothed and kept alive, and somehow you will find the strength to do these things because that is what mothers do. The baby arrives just before midnight. She's small, red-faced, her cries thin and reedy in the dim light of the single lamp that illuminates the room. The midwife cuts the cord with practiced efficiency, washes the baby with water from the basin on the washstand, and wraps her in a worn cotton blanket that has seen too many winters and too many washings. She places the baby in your arms and says, "It's a girl. Healthy, from the looks of her." You look down at your daughter, and you search your heart for the surge of maternal love that is supposed to come in this moment, the overwhelming bond that ties mother to child in an instant of recognition and devotion. You find nothing. Your heart is a locked room, and this baby does not have the key. You see her, you acknowledge her existence, but you cannot feel her. Your emotional reserves have been depleted by years of hardship and the unbearable loss of Freddie, and there is simply nothing left to give. You name her Grace. Grace Pearl Ingalls. Grace because it is a name that speaks of mercy and blessing, and perhaps if you speak the words often enough the reality will follow. Pearl because pearls are formed in darkness, layer by layer, beauty emerging from irritation and pain. The name is a prayer, a hope, a desperate wish that this child will somehow be spared the suffering that has marked her sisters' lives. But even as you whisper the name, you know it is too much to ask. The world does not care about prayers or names or the desperate hopes of exhausted mothers. The world simply is, and children are born into it, and they survive or they do not. And all the love and care in the world cannot protect them from the fundamental randomness of existence. Charles comes into the room after the midwife has left. He looks at the baby with the same blank expression he wears when he looks at everything now, a face that has learned not to show emotion because emotion is dangerous, because caring too much makes the losses unbearable. He reaches out and touches Grace's head with one finger, a brief gesture that might be affection or might simply be acknowledgement. He says, "Another girl. That's all right. Girls are easier." You do not ask what he means by easier. You already know. Girls eat less than boys. Girls can be put to work earlier, helping with household chores and childcare. Girls are not expected to take over the farm or carry on the family name, and so the pressure on them is different, less immediate. Charles is performing the same cold calculation that every frontier parent performs, assessing the new child not as a person, but as an economic unit, determining how this addition to the family will affect the precarious balance between income and expenses. He leaves the room. You hear his footsteps on the stairs, the creak of the door as he goes back outside to finish his work in the stable. You are alone with the baby, and the silence presses down on you like a physical weight. Grace begins to cry, a thin wail that speaks of hunger and cold, and the shock of being thrust from the warm darkness of the womb into a world that is harsh and unforgiving. You unbutton your dress and guide her to your breast. She latches on with the instinctive desperation of a newborn, and you feel the pull of her sucking, the physical drain as your body gives her what it has already given to 4 other children, what it gave to Freddie before he died. And as you sit there in the lamplight feeding your daughter, you think about the life she is inheriting. She will grow up in poverty. She will wear hand-me-down clothes and eat meals that are never quite enough. She will work from the time she's old enough to hold a broom or carry a bucket. She will watch her older sister Mary navigate the world in darkness. She will see her parents grow old before their time, broken by labour and disappointment. She will learn, as all her sisters have learned, that life on the frontier is not an adventure or a grand experiment in American independence. It is a grinding, exhausting struggle for survival, and most people lose. But she will also have something that you cannot quite name, something that even your exhausted, shut-down heart recognizes in this moment. She will have the knowledge that she was born into loss, that she came into the world carrying the weight of the brother who died before her, and perhaps that knowledge will make her strong. Perhaps it will teach her to hold on when others let go, to endure when others break, to keep moving forward even when there is no clear destination, or perhaps it will crush her. Perhaps the weight will be too much, and she will spend her entire life trying to fill a void that can never be filled, trying to earn a love that was spent on a ghost. You do not know which future awaits her. You can only feed her and keep her warm and hope that she is stronger than you feel in this moment. Outside the window, the Iowa night is dark and quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks. The wind rattles the loose boards on the side of the hotel. And in your arms, Grace Pearl Ingalls, 3 hours old, falls asleep at your breast, unaware that she has just entered a story that will be both forgotten and remembered, erased from the official record but preserved in the memories of those who knew the truth. You need to understand something about Burr Oak before you can understand why Grace's birth here matters, why this place shaped her in ways that no one bothered to record until historians started digging through old documents and census records, decades after everyone involved was dead. Burr Oak, Iowa in 1877 is not a destination. It is a place where people wash up when they have nowhere else to go, when the dreams have failed and the money has run out and the only option left is to take whatever work you can find and try to survive until something better comes along. It is a town of perhaps 200 people, maybe less, situated in the northeast corner of the state in a region of rolling hills and hardwood forests. It has a general store, a blacksmith shop, a church, and the Masters Hotel, and that is about all. The Ingalls family arrived here in the autumn of 1876, just weeks after Freddie died. They came because Charles had heard there was work available at the hotel, that the owner William Masters needed someone to manage the stable and do odd jobs around the property. The pay was minimal, but it came with lodging, a small room in the hotel, and meals from the kitchen, and when you're broke and grieving and desperate, minimal pay with lodging is better than no pay at all. So Caroline and Charles packed up the 3 surviving daughters and what few possessions they owned, and they left Walnut Grove and the grave of their son, and they came to Burr Oak and moved into the Masters Hotel, and they told themselves this was temporary, just a stopping point until Charles could save enough money to try farming again, until the family could get back on its feet and resume the westward journey that had defined their lives. But temporary has a way of stretching out when you are poor. Days become weeks, weeks become months, and suddenly you have been in Burr Oak for half a year, then 9 months, and you are no closer to leaving than you were when you arrived. The work at the hotel is hard and demeaning. Caroline, who once kept a neat little house and took pride in her domestic skills, is now scrubbing floors that dozens of strangers have walked on with mud-caked boots, washing sheets that smell of sweat and tobacco, and sometimes worse, cooking meals for people who treat her like a servant because that is what she has become. Charles, who once owned his own farm and took orders from no one, is now at the beck and call of William Masters, mucking out stables and hauling firewood and fixing broken wagon wheels for travellers who pass through town and never look back. The girls help too. Mary, despite her blindness, can fold laundry and peel potatoes and rock the cradle when other guests bring babies. Laura, at 10 years old, is already doing the work of an adult, carrying water and sweeping and watching Carrie and running errands into town. Carrie is too young for heavy work, but she learns to stay quiet and out of the way, to make herself small and invisible so she does not add to the burden. And into this environment, Grace is born. She enters a family that is holding on by its fingernails, that has been hollowed out by grief and ground down by poverty, that has no extra reserves of patience or tenderness or joy to give to a new baby. She is fed when she cries, changed when she's wet, kept warm enough to survive. But she's not cooed over, not celebrated, not treated as the miracle that every baby should be. Laura will later write about her childhood in the books that make her famous, and she will tell stories about the little house in the big woods of Wisconsin, the prairie in Kansas, the Dugout by Plum Creek in Minnesota, and the new town of Smet in Dakota Territory. She will write about Pa's fiddle and Ma's cooking and the adventures the family had as they moved westward in search of land and opportunity. The books will be charming and nostalgic, full of hardship but also full of warmth. a portrait of pioneer life that emphasizes resilience and family bonds and the triumph of the human spirit over adversity. Laura will never write about Burr Oak. She will never mention the Masters Hotel, or the year the family spent in Iowa, or the fact that her baby sister Grace was born in a place so bleak and desperate that erasing it from memory seemed like the kindest thing to do. The omission is deliberate, a conscious decision to remove this chapter from the official story because it does not fit the narrative, because it is too raw and too shameful and too honest about what failure looks like on the frontier. But Grace will carry Burr Oak with her anyway, not as a memory, because she's too young to remember, but as an imprint, a cellular knowledge that she was born into chaos and grief, that her arrival was not celebrated, that the world she entered was not safe or stable or welcoming. This knowledge will shape her in ways that are invisible but profound, teaching her to be quiet and undemanding, to take up as little space as possible, to avoid conflict and seek approval, and never quite believe that she is wanted for herself rather than for what she can do or provide. Psychologists will later have names for this kind of damage. They will talk about attachment wounds and developmental trauma, and the long-term effects of being born to a mother who is too depressed and exhausted to bond with her child. They will explain that the first months of life are critical for forming the neural pathways that govern emotional regulation and relationship patterns, that a baby who is fed but not held, kept alive but not cherished, grows into an adult who struggles to feel secure in their own skin. But in 1877, no one knows any of this. There are no psychologists on the frontier, no books about childhood development or attachment theory. There is only survival, and the Ingalls family is surviving, and Grace is alive, and that will have to be enough. 6 weeks after Grace is born, the family leaves Burr Oak. Charles has saved just enough money to make the move back to Walnut Grove, where he has heard there might be work at a hotel there, or perhaps he can try farming again on a different piece of land. The details are vague, the plans uncertain, but staying in Burr Oak means admitting permanent defeat, and Charles is not ready to do that yet. They pack their belongings into a wagon. They say goodbye to no one, because they have made no real friends here, no connections that matter enough to preserve, and they drive away from the Masters Hotel and the town of Burr Oak, and they never speak of it again, and the year disappears into the silence that families use to protect themselves from memories too painful to examine. But Grace goes with them, 6 weeks old, wrapped in a blanket, carried in her mother's arms. And though she will never remember this place, though she will never know the name of the town where she was born until she's old enough to ask questions and piece together the hidden history, the mark of Burr Oak is on her. She's the child of the erased years, the daughter born in shame and sorrow, the baby who should have been a blessing but was only another burden, and that will matter. It will matter in ways that no one can predict, in the choices she makes and the life she builds, in the quiet, unassuming way she will watch her family die, one by one, until she is the last of the childhood world, the keeper of memories that no one else wants to claim. You're 3 years old, and you're living in a hole in the ground, not a basement, not a storm cellar, a hole carved into the side of a low hill near Plum Creek in Walnut Grove, Minnesota, with sod walls that weep moisture when it rains, a dirt floor that turns to mud when the snow melts, and a ceiling so low that your father has to stoop when he walks from one end to the other. The door is made of rough planks that do not quite fit the frame, and the wind comes through the gaps with a whistle that sounds like something dying slowly. There is one window, a small square of glass that lets in just enough light to remind you that there is a world outside this underground tomb, a world you can see but cannot reach. This is home. This is where you sleep and eat and play and learn what it means to be alive, in a place where survival is not guaranteed and comfort is a luxury that exists only in other people's lives. You do not remember Burr Oak. Your first memories begin here, in the dugout, in the dark and the damp and the smell of earth and mildew and the sweat of 5 people living in a space barely large enough for 2. You do not remember being born into grief, but you carry it anyway. The way you carry the colour of your eyes or the shape of your hands, an inheritance you did not ask for and cannot refuse. Your mother, Carolyn moves through the dugout like a ghost, silent and efficient, her face set in an expression that never changes whether she's cooking dinner or mending clothes or staring at the wall in the rare moments when there is no work to do. She does not sing. She does not hum while she works. She does not gather you into her lap and tell you stories or stroke your hair or whisper that you're precious and loved. She feeds you when you are hungry, washes you when you are dirty, puts you to bed when night falls. These are mechanical actions, duties performed without affection, and you learn not to expect more. Your father Charles is gone most days, working in town at whatever jobs he can find to bring in money. When he is home, he sits by the small stove and plays his fiddle, the one possession he has never sold or traded, the one thing that still brings him something resembling joy. The music is beautiful and sad, melodies that speak of longing and loss, and you sit on the dirt floor and listen, and feel something stirring in your chest that you do not have words for yet. It is the knowledge that beauty and sorrow are inseparable, that the sweetest songs are the ones born from pain. Your sister Mary is 14 now, and she is blind. You have never known her any other way, so to you. Blindness is simply part of who she is, like her brown hair or her quiet voice. She sits at the table and braids rag rugs from strips of worn-out clothing, her fingers moving with confidence across the fabric, creating patterns she cannot see but knows by touch. She is patient with you when you toddle over and tangle the strips or knock over her work basket, and in those moments you catch glimpses of tenderness that you do not receive from your mother, small kindnesses that make you feel seen. Your sister Laura is 12, and she terrifies you, not because she is cruel, but because she is so fierce, so intense, so filled with a restless energy that has nowhere to go in the confines of the dugout. She does not play with you the way children are supposed to play with their younger siblings. She tolerates you. She watches you with eyes that seem to see too much, that look at you as if you're a puzzle she's trying to solve, and when she speaks to you, her voice is sharp and impatient, the voice of someone who has been given too much responsibility too young and resents the burden. Your sister Carrie is 9, and she is the only one who treats you like you matter. She lets you follow her around the dugout. She shows you how to help with simple tasks, folding the cloth napkins or sorting buttons or holding the dustpan while she sweeps. She tells you the names of things, teaching you words for objects and animals and people, patiently repeating them until you can say them yourself. She is not warm exactly, but she is present, and in a family where everyone else is locked inside their own private sorrows, presence is the closest thing to love you are going to get. You sleep in a narrow bed with Carrie, the two of you pressed together for warmth, because there are not enough blankets to go around, and the dugout is always cold, even in summer when the sun beats down on the prairie above. You listen to her breathing in the dark, the steady rhythm that tells you that you're not alone, and you learn to match your breaths to hers, inhaling and exhaling in sync, a silent conversation between sisters who have no other language for connection. The dugout smells like earth and dampness and poverty. It smells like the unwashed bodies of people who do not have enough water to bathe regularly, like the smoke from the stove when the wood is too green to burn cleanly, like the chamber pot that sits in the corner because it is too cold to go outside in the middle of the night. It smells like defeat, like dreams that have rotted in the ground, like a family that has learned to survive but has forgotten how to thrive. But it also smells like bread on the days when there is enough flour to bake, like the coffee your father drinks in the morning, when there are a few precious beans left in the tin, like the wild roses that grow near the creek in the summer, and that Carrie sometimes picks and brings inside to put in a tin cup on the table. This is the world you're learning to navigate. This is the education no school will ever teach you. How to be quiet when adults are talking, how to make yourself small so you do not get in the way, how to eat slowly so the small portions last longer, how to never complain because complaining makes everything worse. You're 2 years old when the family packs everything into a wagon and leaves Walnut Grove for the last time, heading west to Dakota territory, where your father has heard there is free land for homesteading and work with the railroad company that is pushing westward across the prairie. You do not understand what is happening. You only know that the dugout, the dark hole that has been the only home you can remember is being abandoned, and the few possessions the family owns are being loaded into a wagon, with high wooden sides and a canvas cover stretched over curved boughs. Your mother wraps you in a blanket and places you in the back of the wagon between bundles and boxes, and Carrie climbs in beside you, and Mary sits near the front, her hands folded in her lap, her blind eyes staring at nothing. Laura drives the wagon with your father walking alongside, and the journey begins. You lurch and sway as the wheels roll over the rutted trail, and you watch through the gap in the canvas as the landscape changes from the rolling hills and scattered trees of Minnesota to the vast, flat emptiness of the Dakota prairie. A landscape so huge and featureless that it feels like falling into an endless sky. The trip takes weeks. You sleep in the wagon at night, curled against Carrie's warmth, listening to the sounds of the prairie, the wind that never stops, the coyotes howling in the distance, the creak of the wagon wheels and the jingle of the harness. You eat meals cooked over an open fire, simple food that tastes of smoke and ash. You learn to relieve yourself behind clumps of prairie grass because there are no outhouses, no privacy, just the open land stretching in every direction, and the knowledge that you are small and vulnerable, and utterly dependent on the adults who may or may not be capable of keeping you safe. When you finally arrive in Smet, Dakota Territory, it is not a town. It is a railroad camp, a collection of rough buildings and tents clustered along the newly laid tracks, a place where men are building something that does not exist yet, a town that is still mostly an idea. Your father has been hired to work as a timekeeper and bookkeeper for the railroad, a job that pays actual wages, and the family is given a small building to live in, the surveyor's house, a one-room structure that is barely weatherproof but is at least above ground and has real walls and a real floor. You're too young to understand what this move means, but you feel it in the way the tension in your mother's shoulders eases slightly, in the way your father's voice loses some of its edge, in the small luxuries that begin to appear, a chicken for Sunday dinner, a bit of sugar for the coffee, shoes that fit instead of ones with holes stuffed with newspaper. Dakota Territory is harsh and beautiful in equal measure. The sky is bigger here than anywhere else you have ever been, a dome of blue or grey or bruised purple that presses down on the land with a weight you can almost feel. The wind never stops blowing, a constant presence that whistles through every crack in the walls and stirs the prairie grass into waves that look like an ocean made of gold and green. Winter comes early and stays late. You are 3 years old during the winter of 1880-1881, the winter that will later be called the hard winter, and you experience it as a child experiences everything, as a series of sensations without context or understanding. You know that it is cold, so cold that the water in the bucket beside the stove freezes solid overnight. You know that the blizzards come one after another, 7 months of storms that bury the house in snowdrifts and trap the family inside for days at a time. You know that food becomes scarce, that the meals get smaller and simpler, that your mother makes bread from wheat that your father and Ingalls Wilder twist in a coffee mill until their hands bleed, and the bread tastes bitter and strange, but it is all there is. You do not understand that the family is starving. You only know that your stomach hurts, that you're hungry all the time, that the adults speak in hushed voices about whether the supply train will get through before the food runs out completely. You do not understand that people are dying in other houses, freezing to death or succumbing to illness because the cold and the hunger have weakened their bodies beyond the point of recovery. You're shielded from the worst of it, because you are the youngest, because the family gives you the largest portions of the meagre food, because they wrap you in the warmest blankets and keep you closest to the stove. But you still feel the fear that permeates the surveyor's house like smoke, the knowledge that something terrible is happening, and that the adults who are supposed to protect you are barely holding on themselves. And when spring finally comes, when the snow melts, and the supply trains start running again and food becomes available, you emerge from the winter changed. You're thinner, quieter, more watchful. You have learned that safety is an illusion, that the world can turn hostile without warning, that survival is never guaranteed. You're 5 years old, and you are beginning to understand that your family is not like other families, that the household you are growing up in is shaped by an absence that defines everything. Your sister Mary is 17 now, and her blindness has become the organising principle around which the entire family revolves. She cannot work in the fields or help with the heavy labour, but she can braid rugs and sew shirts and do intricate beadwork that your mother sells to neighbours for a few pennies. She sits at the table for hours every day, her fingers moving across fabric and thread with practised precision, creating beauty that she will never see, and everyone in the family adjusts their lives to accommodate her limitations. You learn to move quietly so you do not startle her. You learn to announce your presence when you enter a room so she knows you are there. You learn to put things back exactly where they belong because Mary navigates by memory and touch. And if the buttercrock is in the wrong place on the shelf or the broom is leaning against the wrong wall, she will stumble and hurt herself, and your mother will give you the look, the one that says you have failed in your duty to protect your sister. The house in Smet is bigger than the surveyor's house. A proper frame building with separate rooms and real glass windows and a wooden floor that does not turn to mud when it rains. Your father built it himself, board by board, and it represents everything he's been working toward for 30 years. Stability, permanence, a place that belongs to the family and cannot be taken away. But even this house, with its solid walls and snug roof, is marked by scarcity. The furniture is plain and handmade. The curtains are sewn from feed sacks. The rugs are braided from worn-out clothing. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is frivolous. Everything serves a purpose. You attend school now, walking the 3 blocks from your house to the schoolhouse that Laura helped christen when she taught there briefly. You are a good student, quiet and obedient, the kind of child who never causes trouble, and therefore never receives much attention. You learn to read and write and do arithmetic, and you discover that you like school because it is a place where your value is measured by your own abilities, rather than by your usefulness to the family or your position in the birth order. But you are always in Mary's shadow. When people in town talk about the Ingalls family, they talk about Charles and his fiddle, about Caroline and her quiet dignity, about Mary and her courage in the face of blindness, about Laura and her fierce independence. They do not talk about you. You are Grace, the youngest, the baby, the one who has not yet done anything worth remembering. You do not resent this exactly. Resentment requires a sense of entitlement, a belief that you deserve more attention or recognition, and you have never developed that belief. You have learned instead to be content with invisibility, to find safety in being overlooked, to take pride in the small tasks you can perform competently, setting the table, feeding the chickens, mending the holes in the family's stockings. Your sister Laura leaves when you are 8 years old, marrying Almanzo Wilder and moving to a claim shanty a mile outside of town. The house feels emptier without her, quieter, and you realise that Laura's intensity and restlessness provided a kind of energy that kept the household from sinking too deeply into routine. Now it is just you and Mary and your parents, and the days follow a pattern so predictable that you could perform them in your sleep. Your sister Carrie leaves too, eventually, taking a job as a printer's apprentice at the newspaper office, learning a trade that will give her independence and income, and then it is just you and Mary at home, 2 daughters who could not be more different. Mary is brilliant, educated, accomplished despite her blindness. She attended the Iowa College for the Blind in Vinton, graduating with honours, learning Latin and higher mathematics and literature, skills that should have opened doors but instead led her back home because there were no jobs available for blind women, no matter how talented or educated. You are ordinary. You have no extraordinary gifts, no remarkable talents. You are pleasant and agreeable and capable, but you're not exceptional. And in a family that has already produced one famous daughter who will write books and another who overcame blindness to achieve academic success, ordinary is the same as invisible. Your mother is aging. She's in her 50s now, and the years of hardship have left their mark. Her hands are gnarled with arthritis. Her back is bent from decades of labour. She moves more slowly, speaks more softly, and you find yourself taking on more of the household work. Not because anyone asks you to, but because it needs to be done and you are the only one available to do it. Your father still plays the fiddle in the evenings, But the music sounds different now, slower and sadder. The melodies of a man who has survived but not triumphed, who has built a life but not the life he dreamed of. You sit on the floor and listen, and sometimes he looks at you with an expression you cannot quite read, something that might be affection or might be regret or might simply be exhaustion. This is your childhood. Quiet, unremarkable, defined by duty and responsibility, and the knowledge that you are the one who will stay, the one who will be here when everyone else has left, the daughter who will witness the slow decline of the pioneer generation, and the end of the world the Little House books will make famous. You do not know this yet. You're only 12 years old, and the future is still opaque, still full of possibilities you cannot imagine. But the pattern is already set, the role already written, and you are learning your lines whether you realize it or not. You're 16 years old, and you're the only child left in the house on 3rd Street, and the silence is so thick you could choke on it. Your sister Laura has been married for 11 years now, living on Rocky Ridge Farm in Missouri with Almanzo and their daughter Rose, sending letters that arrive every few months filled with news about farming and chickens and the ordinary struggles of making a life in the Ozarks. She does not ask about you. She asks about Ma and Pa, about Mary, about whether the crops were good this year and whether the town is growing. You're mentioned in passing, if at all, a footnote in a story that has already moved on without you. Your sister Carrie is working in Rapid City now, living independently, earning her own money as a printer and newspaper correspondent. She has escaped. She has built a life that does not revolve around the needs of parents who are aging or a sister who cannot see. She sends money home when she can, dutiful but distant, and when she visits she stays for a weekend and then leaves again, and you can see the relief in her face when she boards the train back to her own life. Your sister Mary is 30 now, still living at home because there is nowhere else for her to go. She's been back from the Iowa College for the Blind for 6 years, and those 6 years have been a slow erosion of hope. She cannot find work. She cannot marry because what man would take on a blind wife in a world where women are valued primarily for their domestic labour and their ability to bear healthy children? She sits at the table and does her beadwork and her sewing, earning a few dollars here and there, but mostly she's dependent on Ma and Pa, and by extension, on you. And you are the one who stayed. Not because anyone asked you to, not because there was a family meeting where roles were assigned and sacrifices negotiated. You stayed because that is what good daughters do, because leaving would mean abandoning your parents in their old age, and your blind sister who needs care, and you have been raised to believe that duty comes before desire, that selfishness is a sin, that your own wants and needs are less important than the obligations you were born into. You attend school until you are 17, and then you go to normal school in Redfield, a teacher training program that takes 6 weeks and costs money the family can barely afford, but that your father insists on paying because even he understands that you need some kind of skill, some way to earn a living, some insurance against the possibility that you will end up like Mary, educated but unemployable, trapped in a house that feels smaller every year. You're a good student at normal school. You learn how to structure lessons and manage a classroom and teach reading and arithmetic to children who may or may not want to learn. You learn the theory of education, the pedagogical methods that are supposed to turn you into an effective teacher. But what you really learn is that you are competent but not remarkable, that you can do the work but you will never be the teacher that students remember decades later, the one who changed their lives or inspired their dreams. You return to Smet with your teaching certificate, and you find a position at a rural school 7 miles west of town in Manchester Township. The job pays $30 a month during the school term, which runs from November through March. $30 a month is more money than you have ever earned in your life, and you send most of it home to Ma and Pa because the farm is not producing enough to cover expenses, and Mary's beadwork does not bring in sufficient income, and someone has to pay for the coal and the flour and the doctor's visits when Pa's heart starts acting up. You board with families near the school during the week, sleeping in spare rooms or on sofas, eating meals with strangers who are kind enough but who do not particularly care about your presence beyond the fact that you are the teacher, and therefore entitled to basic hospitality. On Fridays, you ride back to Smet in whatever wagon or sleigh happens to be heading in that direction, and you spend the weekends helping Ma with the housework and sitting with Mary, and listening to Pa play the fiddle in the evenings. This is your life. This is the shape of your days. Teaching children who will forget you the moment the school term ends. Boarding with families who see you as a function rather than a person. Sending your wages home to support a household that would collapse without you. And spending your weekends in a house where no one asks how you are or what you want, or whether you ever dream of something different. You're 19 years old, and you have already settled into the rhythm of spinsterhood, the pattern that unmarried women fall into when they are neither beautiful enough, nor wealthy enough, nor interesting enough to attract a husband. You tell yourself that you do not mind, that marriage is not for everyone, that there is dignity and duty and purpose in service. But sometimes, late at night when you are lying on a stranger's sofa in a farmhouse miles from anywhere, you allow yourself to imagine a different life, a life where someone looks at you and sees not a teacher or a daughter or a sister, but a woman worth knowing for her own sake. A life where your value is not measured by your usefulness, but by your simple existence. And then you push the thought away, because wanting things you cannot have is a waste of energy. And you have learned to be practical above all else. Smet in the 1890s is a town that has stopped growing, a place that reached its peak during the land boom of the early 80s and has been slowly contracting ever since, losing people to homestead failures and economic downturns, and the simple realization that farming in Dakota territory is harder and less profitable than the railroad brochures promised. The main street is lined with false-fronted buildings that looked optimistic and ambitious when they were built, but now just look tired. The paint is peeling, the boardwalks are warped and splintered. The businesses that remain, the general store, the hardware store, the hotel, the newspaper office, are operated by the same families who started them 15 years ago, and they are surviving but not thriving, making just enough to stay open but not enough to expand or improve. The population has stabilized at around 500 people, and everyone knows everyone else's business. You cannot walk down the street without being greeted by name, without being asked about your parents or your teaching position, or whether you have heard from Laura lately. The familiarity is both comforting and suffocating. There are no secrets in Smet, no possibility of reinvention, no escape from the role you have been assigned by birth and circumstance. You teach in the rural schools around the county, moving from one district to another as positions become available. District 37, District 58. One-room schoolhouses that serve farming families scattered across the prairie, children who arrive on foot or horseback or in wagons driven by older siblings, children whose hands are rough from farm work and whose clothes are patched and mended and passed down from older brothers and sisters. You teach them reading from McGuffey's readers, arithmetic from slates and chalk, geography from maps that show a world most of them will never see. You teach them penmanship and spelling and the basic facts of American history. You maintain discipline with a ruler and a stern voice, because frontier children respect authority, but only if that authority is backed by the credible threat of consequences. Some of your students are sweet and eager to learn. Some are sullen and resentful, forced to attend school when they would rather be working on the farm. Some are bright enough to go further in their education but will not, because their families need their labour and cannot afford to let them stay in school past the 8th grade. You watch potential waste away in children who could have been something more, and you understand with bitter clarity that you are watching your own story play out in a different generation. You are good at your job, not inspired, not transformative, but competent and reliable. The school boards rehire you year after year because you show up on time and maintain order and do not create problems. Parents respect you. Children tolerate you. And that is enough, because enough is all anyone expects from someone like you. Between school terms, you help Ma with the house and the garden. You take over more of the physical labour as your mother's arthritis worsens, hauling water and scrubbing floors and hanging laundry on the line to dry in the prairie wind that never stops blowing. You cook meals that stretch the budget, beans and cornbread and fried salt pork, with fresh vegetables in the summer and root vegetables stored in the cellar for winter. You mend clothing until the fabric is more patch than original material, and when something cannot be mended anymore, you cut it up for quilt pieces or rag rugs. You care for Mary. This is never discussed or negotiated. It is simply understood that Mary is your responsibility now that Ma is too old and tired to provide the constant attention that a blind adult requires. You read to her from the newspapers and magazines that arrive in the mail. You describe the world outside the windows, who is walking past the house, what the weather looks like, whether the roses in the front yard are blooming yet. You guide her arm when you walk together, warning her about steps or uneven ground or obstacles in her path. You help her dress when the buttons are too small for her to manage by touch alone. Mary does not thank you. She accepts your help with the assumption that it is owed to her, that her blindness entitles her to service from the sister who can see. And perhaps she is right. Perhaps this is simply the bargain that families make, the strong supporting the weak, the able-bodied caring for the disabled. But there are moments when you resent the assumption, when you want to scream that you have needs too, that you are tired and lonely and trapped just as surely as Mary is trapped by her darkness. But you do not scream. You swallow the resentment and you do the work, and you tell yourself that this is what love looks like when it is stripped of sentimentality and reduced to its essential core, showing up day after day, doing what needs to be done whether you feel like it or not. Your father's health is declining, his heart is failing, the result of decades of physical labour and stress, and the diphtheria that nearly killed Almanzo, but also damaged Charles's heart when he caught a milder case years ago. He cannot do heavy work anymore. He spends most of his time in his chair by the stove, reading or playing his fiddle or simply staring at nothing. He is 64 years old, and he is dying slowly, and everyone in the house knows it, but no one speaks of it directly. You are 23 years old when you meet Nathan William Dow, and the meeting is so unremarkable that you almost do not notice it happening. He is not handsome. He is not charming. He is not the kind of man who turns heads when he walks into a room or inspires romantic daydreams in young women who read novels about dashing heroes and passionate love affairs. He's 41 years old, 18 years your senior, a farmer who owns 160 acres of marginal land near Manchester, 7 miles west of Smet. He is weathered and quiet and practical, a man who measures his words carefully and does not waste time on small talk or social niceties. You meet him through the school where you teach, District 37 in Manchester Township. He's on the school board, one of the farmers who oversees the budget and hires the teachers and makes sure the schoolhouse roof does not leak and the stove has fuel for the winter. He comes to observe your teaching one afternoon in December, sitting in the back of the room while you lead the students through a geography lesson about the major rivers of the United States. He does not speak. He simply watches, his face expressionless, and when the lesson is finished and the children are dismissed for the day, he nods once and says, "You do good work, Miss Ingalls." That is all. 4 words. But they are the first words of approval you have received in months, maybe years, and they sink into your chest like warm stones. He starts appearing at the school more often after that, always with an excuse. He needs to check the woodpile, or repair a loose floorboard, or discuss the budget with you, but you begin to sense that the excuses are just that, excuses, and that the real reason he is there is to see you. He does not flirt. He does not pay you compliments or bring you flowers or engage in any of the courtship rituals that young people use to signal romantic interest. He simply shows up, and he talks to you in his quiet, measured way about practical things, the weather, the crops, the politics of the school board. You are not sure at first whether you are imagining the attention or whether it is real. You have no experience with courtship, no framework for understanding whether a 41-year-old farmer who repairs floorboards and talks about the weather is expressing interest or simply being neighbourly. But then he asks if he can drive you back to Smet on Friday afternoon. And you say yes, and the two of you ride in his wagon through the winter twilight, and he tells you about his farm and his plans for the spring planting, and you realise that this is what courtship looks like when the people involved are practical and middle-aged, and not given to grand gestures or romantic declarations. Nathan Dow is a widower. His first wife died in childbirth 15 years ago, taking the baby with her, and he has been alone ever since, working his farm with the help of hired men during harvest season and living in a small house that is clean but sparse, a place where function matters and decoration does not. He's not looking for a young bride who will give him a house full of children. He's looking for a partner, someone who can manage a household and help with the lighter farm work and provide companionship in a life that has become too solitary. You understand this. You understand that what he is offering is not romance but pragmatism, a practical arrangement that benefits both parties. He gets a wife who can cook and clean and keep the house running. You get a home of your own, a chance to leave your parents' house, and the burden of caring for Mary, a measure of independence even if that independence comes with a different set of obligations. He proposes in the spring, on a Sunday afternoon when he is driven into Smet to attend church and then call on you at your parents' house. He sits in the parlour with his hat in his hands, and he speaks to your father first, asking permission in the old-fashioned way, and your father nods and says, "If Grace is willing, then you have my blessing." And then Nathan turns to you and says, "Miss Ingalls, I would be honoured if you would consent to be my wife." There is no declaration of love. There is no promise of happiness or passion, or the kind of deep emotional connection that novels tell you marriage should be built on. There is only the offer, stated plainly, and the expectation that you will give him an answer. You say yes. Not because you are in love with Nathan Dow, but because you are 24 years old, and this is the only proposal you are likely to receive. Because staying in your parents' house means watching your father die, and spending the rest of your life caring for Mary. Because marriage, even a practical marriage to a man nearly twice your age, represents a kind of escape. The wedding is held on October 16th, 1901, in the parlour of your parents' house on 3rd Street. It is a small ceremony, attended only by family and a few close friends. You wear a simple dress that Ma has sewn for the occasion. Nothing fancy, because fancy would be wasteful and inappropriate for a woman marrying at 24. Your father gives you away, though he can barely stand for the duration of the ceremony, his heart labouring in his chest, his face grey with fatigue. Mary is there, sitting quietly in a chair near the window, her hands folded in her lap. Carrie has come home for the occasion, and she hugs you afterward and whispers, "Be happy, Grace," as if happiness is something you can choose through sheer force of will. Laura is not there. She's in Missouri, too far away and too busy with her own farm and her own family to make the trip for her baby sister's wedding. She sends a letter instead, a brief note of congratulations that arrives a week after the ceremony, and you fold it carefully and put it away in a drawer and tell yourself that it does not matter, that you did not expect her to come anyway. Nathan drives you back to Manchester in his wagon, your few belongings packed in a trunk in the back. And as you ride away from De Smet, away from the house where you grew up and the family that defined your entire existence, you feel not joy or excitement or fear, but a strange, hollow numbness, as if you are watching someone else's life unfold from a great distance. This is your wedding day. This is the beginning of your adult life, and all you can think is that you have traded one set of obligations for another, one form of invisibility for a different version of the same thing. You are Grace Dow now, not Grace Ingalls, and the name change feels like putting on a coat that does not quite fit, something you will grow accustomed to through repeated wearing, but that will never feel entirely natural. The house on Nathan's farm is small, 2 rooms downstairs and a sleeping loft upstairs that is too hot in summer and too cold in winter. The kitchen takes up most of the first floor, dominated by a cast-iron cook stove that requires constant feeding and produces heat that is either insufficient or overwhelming with no comfortable middle ground. There is a table with 4 chairs, though only 2 of them are ever used. There is a dry sink with a hand pump that draws water from the well outside. There is a pantry with shelves that are never quite full enough, stocked with flour and sugar and salt and the preserved vegetables you put up in the fall. The second room serves as a parlour, though that is a generous description for a space that contains a worn sofa, a rocking chair, and a small table that holds Nathan's Bible and a lamp. The walls are bare except for a single photograph of Nathan's first wife, a stern-faced woman in a high-necked dress who stares at you from her frame with an expression that might be judgment, or might simply be the discomfort of sitting still for the long exposure time that early cameras required. You do not ask Nathan to remove the photograph. It would be petty and cruel to demand that he erase the memory of a woman who died giving him the child he wanted. And besides, you do not feel threatened by a ghost. The dead are not your competition. They have the advantage of being frozen in time, forever young, and unblemished by the disappointments and compromises that living requires. Your married life settles into a routine so predictable, you could perform it in your sleep. You wake before dawn and light the stove and make breakfast. Coffee, fried eggs when the chickens are producing, biscuits or cornbread, salt pork or bacon if there is any in the smokehouse. Nathan eats in silence, his focus on the plate in front of him, and then he puts on his hat and goes out to begin the day's work, feeding livestock, mending fences, ploughing fields, whatever task the season demands. You spend your days doing the work that farm wives have done for generations. You haul water from the well, bucket by bucket, for cooking and washing and cleaning. You scrub floors and wash windows and beat rugs until your arms ache. You tend the vegetable garden, pulling weeds and watering plants and harvesting whatever manages to survive the Dakota weather. You feed the chickens and collect eggs and slaughter birds when Nathan wants chicken for Sunday dinner, wringing their necks with a quick twist that you have learned to perform without flinching. You cook 3 meals a day, plain food made from whatever is available. Beans and cornbread, fried potatoes, stewed vegetables, tough cuts of meat boiled until they are tender enough to chew. You bake bread twice a week, kneading the dough until your knuckles are raw, shaping the loaves and setting them to rise and sliding them into the oven that is never quite the right temperature. You preserve food in the fall, filling mason jars with tomatoes and beans and pickles and fruit when there is any to spare, preparing for the winter months when nothing grows and the pantry is all that stands between the household and hunger. Nathan is not unkind. He does not raise his voice or his hand. He pays you the compliment of expecting competence, and does not criticize when meals are late, or the house is not as clean as it should be. He provides for you to the best of his ability, which means that you are housed and fed and clothed but never comfortable, never secure, always aware that one bad harvest or one injured horse or one serious illness could tip the balance from marginal survival into complete disaster. But he's also not affectionate. He does not touch you except when necessity requires it. The brief and perfunctory marital relations that take place in the darkness of the sleeping loft on Saturday nights, mechanical transactions that satisfy biological needs but create no intimacy or warmth. He does not ask about your day or your thoughts or your feelings. He does not notice when you are tired or sad or lonely. He simply expects you to be there, performing the functions that a wife performs, and to do so without complaint or expectation of recognition. You tell yourself that this is normal, that marriage for people like you, practical people, rural people, people who have learned not to expect too much from life, is not about romance or emotional connection, but about partnership and survival. You tell yourself that you're lucky to have a home and a husband who does not beat you or drink away the farm's income, or abandon you for another woman. You tell yourself that contentment is a more realistic goal than happiness, and that you are content. But late at night, when Nathan is snoring beside you, and the house creaks in the wind, and the emptiness of the prairie presses in from all sides, you allow yourself to feel the loneliness that you suppressed during the daylight hours. You're 24 years old and you are married, and you have never felt more alone in your life. You have traded the isolation of being the forgotten daughter in your parents' house for the isolation of being the invisible wife in your husband's house. And the only difference is that now you have different chores to perform and a different set of walls to stare at. You do not have children. The first year passes, then the second, and your monthly courses continue to arrive with depressing regularity, proof that your body is capable of pregnancy but that pregnancy is not occurring. You do not know whether the problem is with you or with Nathan, and there is no way to find out because doctors do not discuss such things, and asking would be indelicate and pointless anyway. Childlessness is simply another fact of your life, another disappointment to add to the collection, another way in which you are failing to fulfill the role that society has assigned you. Nathan does not speak of it. He does not express disappointment or frustration or grief over the children who will never exist. He simply accepts it, the way he accepts drought and hail and all the other things that cannot be controlled, and life continues in its predictable, joyless rhythm. You are in your second year of marriage when the letter arrives from Carrie, and you know before you open it that something is wrong because Carrie only writes when there is news that cannot wait, when the situation has deteriorated past the point where it can be handled without outside intervention. Pa is dying. The letter does not use those words exactly, but the meaning is clear. His heart is failing. He can barely get out of bed. Dr. Sherman has been called multiple times, and there is nothing more he can do except prescribe rest and digitalis, and offer the kind of vague reassurances that doctors give when they know the patient is beyond saving, but do not want to say so directly. Ma is caring for him as best she can, but she is 62 years old and exhausted, and Mary is no help because she cannot see to repair medicines or assist with the physical care that a bedridden patient requires. You should come home, Carrie writes. Not because there is anything you can do to change the outcome, but because Pa is asking for you, because he wants to see all his daughters one more time before the end, because this is your duty as a daughter, even if you're now a married woman with a household of your own. You show the letter to Nathan. He reads it without expression, then hands it back to you and says, "How long will you be gone?" "A week, maybe 2, you say, though you have no idea whether this is accurate. How long does dying take when the process has already begun? Days? Weeks? Months? "I can manage," Nathan says, which is not permission exactly, but is as close as he will come to acknowledging that you have obligations beyond the farm. You pack a small bag and take the train to Smet, 7 miles that feel like 700, and when you arrive at the house on 3rd Street, you are shocked by how much has changed in the 2 years since you left. The house looks smaller, shabbier, the paint peeling and the porch sagging, and the yard overgrown with weeds that no one has the energy to pull. Ma opens the door and she looks ancient, her face lined and grey, her hands twisted with arthritis, her shoulders bent under the weight of grief that has not yet been allowed full expression, because Pa is still alive, and there is still work to be done. Mary is in the parlour, sitting in her usual chair by the window, and she turns her face toward you when you enter, but does not stand or offer a greeting. "Grace," she says, acknowledging your presence, and that is all. Pa is in the bedroom upstairs, and when you climb the stairs and push open the door, the smell hits you first. The sour odour of unwashed flesh and chamber pots that have not been emptied often enough, and the peculiar sweetness that seems to accompany dying, as if the body is already beginning to rot while the person is still alive. He's lying in the bed, propped up on pillows because lying flat makes it too hard to breathe. His face is grey, his cheeks sunken, his eyes closed. His breathing is laboured, each inhalation a struggle, each exhalation a rattle that sounds like gravel being shaken in a tin can. He looks impossibly old, impossibly fragile, and you realise with a shock that this man, who once built houses with his bare hands and walked across the prairie with a plough and sang songs while he worked, has been reduced to this, a collection of failing organs wrapped in skin that hangs loose on bones that are too prominent. You sit down in the chair beside the bed, and you take his hand, and his skin is cool and dry, papery thin, and you can feel the bones beneath it like a skeleton waiting to emerge. "Pa," you say softly, "it's Grace. I'm here." His eyes open, slowly, and he looks at you with an expression that takes a moment to focus, as if he's returning from a great distance. "Grace," he whispers, and his voice is barely audible, a thread of sound that you have to lean in close to hear. "My baby girl. You're 25 years old, a married woman, but in this moment, you're 3 years old again, sitting on the floor of the surveyor's house listening to him play the fiddle, and the years collapse into nothing, and you are both who you were and who you have become, and the grief rises in your throat like water filling a well. 'I'm here, Pa,' you say again, because you do not know what else to say, because there are no words adequate to this moment, no language that can bridge the gap between the living and the dying." He closes his eyes again, and you sit there holding his hand, and you understand that this is all you can offer him now: presence, witness, the knowledge that he is not alone in this final passage. Pa dies on June 8th, a Sunday morning, and the day is beautiful in the way that makes death seem like an insult, like a cosmic joke played by a universe that does not care about human suffering. The sky is cloudless and blue, the kind of blue that makes you squint when you look up. The sun is warm but not oppressive, the temperature perfect for the first real day of summer. The birds are singing in the trees that Pa planted 20 years ago, trees that have grown tall and leafy and provide shade for the house he built with his own hands. The lilacs beside the porch are in bloom, filling the air with their sweet, almost cloying fragrance. You're sitting beside his bed when it happens. Ma is downstairs making breakfast that no one will eat. Mary is in the parlour. Carrie has not yet arrived. The telegram you sent 2 days ago has not reached her in time. Laura is in Missouri, too far away to come, and you know that this will haunt her for the rest of her life. The fact that she was not here when Pa died, that she missed the chance to say goodbye. But you are here. You, the forgotten daughter, the one who was never supposed to matter, are the one sitting vigil when Charles Ingalls takes his last breath. It is not dramatic. There is no final speech, no profound last words, no moment of clarity where he opens his eyes and sees something beyond the veil and describes it for those left behind. He simply stops breathing. One breath, rattling and wet, then another shallower, then another barely there, and then nothing. Silence, stillness, the absence of the sound that has filled the room for days. The laboured breathing that told you he was still fighting, still holding on. You sit there for a long moment, still holding his hand, and you wait to feel something. Grief, certainly. Relief that his suffering is over. Something. But what you feel instead is a strange, hollow detachment, as if you are watching this scene from outside your own body, as if the woman sitting beside the bed holding the dead man's hand is not really you, but an actress playing the role of the bereaved daughter. You stand up, slowly, and you smooth the blanket across his chest with careful mechanical movements. You close his eyes, pressing your fingers gently against the lids until they stay shut. You fold his hands across his stomach, arranging them the way bodies are arranged in coffins, and then you go downstairs to tell Ma. She's standing at the stove, stirring a pot of oatmeal that has begun to scorch because she's forgotten to tend it. You walk up behind her and put your hand on her shoulder, and she turns to look at you, and she knows before you speak. She knows from your face, from the way you are standing, from the fact that you have come downstairs instead of staying with him. He's gone, you say. She nods. She does not cry. She simply turns back to the stove and moves the pot off the heat, and she stands there staring at the burned oatmeal as if it is the most important thing in the world, as if focusing on this small domestic failure will keep the larger loss at bay. Mary comes into the kitchen, guided by the sound of voices. "Is he?" she begins, and you say, "Yes," and she sinks into a chair at the table and sits very still, her blind eyes staring at nothing. And you cannot tell whether she's grieving or simply processing the information, adding it to the catalogue of losses that have defined her life. The next hours pass in a blur of necessary tasks. Someone has to notify the undertaker. Someone has to send telegrams to Laura and Carrie. Someone has to notify the church, the neighbours, the newspaper. You do these things because Ma is in no condition to do them, and Mary cannot, and so they fall to you, the daughter who stayed, the one who is present when presence is required. The funeral is held 3 days later at the Congregational Church. The coffin is simple pine, unadorned except for the brass handles that Nathan insists on paying for, a gesture of respect from your husband to the father-in-law he barely knew. Pa is dressed in his best suit, the one he wore for weddings and special occasions, and someone has placed his fiddle beside him in the coffin, because a life cannot be summed up in wood and cloth, but symbols help, and the fiddle is the symbol everyone remembers. The church is full. Pa was known and liked in Smet, one of the founding families, a man who played music at community gatherings and helped neighbours when they needed it, and never spoke ill of anyone. The minister gives a sermon about faith and perseverance and the pioneer spirit. Words that sound comforting but mean nothing. Pretty sounds arranged in pleasant patterns that dissolve into the air without changing anything. Laura is not there. She could not make the journey in time, and so the three daughters, Mary, Carrie and you, sit in the front pew with Ma between you, four women in black dresses holding themselves together through sheer force of will. They bury him in the Smet cemetery, in a plot that Ma has already purchased for herself and for Mary, and for whichever other daughters choose to return to this place when their own times come. The grave is deep and rectangular, and when they lower the coffin into it, you think about how small it looks, how insufficient to contain a man who once seemed larger than life, who filled rooms with his music and his stories and his quiet strength. And then it is over. The first death. The first pillar of your childhood world removed, leaving the structure weakened but still standing for now. You go back to Manchester with Nathan the next day. Back to the small house and the endless work and the silence that is different from the silence before. Heavier somehow, weighted with the knowledge that the world you came from is disappearing, one person at a time, and you cannot stop it. You're 27 years old, and you are living two lives that never quite connect, shuttling between them like a person caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. There is the life in Manchester with Nathan, where you are a farm wife performing the endless repetitive tasks that farm wives perform, cooking and cleaning and washing and mending, tending the garden and feeding the chickens and preserving food for winter. The work is hard and monotonous, but it is yours, the domain you control, the space where you make decisions about what to cook for dinner and when to plant the beans and how to stretch the grocery budget through the lean months. And then there is the life in Smet, where you're still Grace Ingalls, still the daughter who's expected to help Ma care for Mary, still the one who comes when she's needed because Carrie is in Rapid City, and Laura is in Missouri and you are only 7 miles away, close enough that distance cannot be used as an excuse. You make the trip to Smet at least once a week, sometimes more often when Ma sends word that she needs help with a task that is too difficult for her arthritic hands, or when Mary is having one of her difficult days. The days when blindness feels like a fresh wound rather than an old scar, and she needs someone to sit with her and read aloud and remind her that the world still exists beyond the darkness. Ma is aging rapidly now that Pa is gone. She's 63, then 65, then 68, and each year strips away more of the strength and competence that once defined her. Her hands shake when she tries to pour coffee. Her back is so bent that she can barely stand upright. Her hearing is failing, which means you have to raise your voice to be understood, shouting conversations that should be intimate and quiet. She refuses to acknowledge her own decline, insisting that she can still manage the house and care for Mary, and maintain the independence she has fought so hard to preserve. But the evidence contradicts her, visible in the unwashed dishes stacked in the sink and the dust thick on the furniture, and the meals that consist of bread and tea, because cooking a proper dinner requires more energy than she possesses. You help without being asked. You arrive at the house on 3rd Street and you assess what needs to be done and you do it, washing the dishes and scrubbing the floors and cooking meals that you portion out and leave in the icebox with instructions written in large letters that Ma can read without her spectacles. You wash and mend the clothes, you beat the rugs and clean the windows and pull the weeds from the garden that Pa planted and that Ma can no longer maintain. Mary accepts your help with the same entitled silence she has always employed, as if service is her due, as if the world owes her compensation for the sight she lost at 14. She sits in her chair by the window and does her beadwork, creating intricate patterns that sell for a few dollars at the church bazaar, and she does not thank you for the work you do, or acknowledge the sacrifice you are making. Leaving your own household to care for hers, you do not complain. Complaining would change nothing, and besides, this is what daughters do, what you have been trained to do since childhood. Put others' needs before your own, perform labour without expectation of recognition, carry burdens without asking whether the weight is fair. But you also begin to carve out a small space for yourself, a piece of life that belongs to you alone and not to the family or to Nathan or to the endless cycle of obligation and duty. You start writing for the local newspapers, not literature, not the kind of writing that Laura is beginning to explore in her farm journal columns, but simple correspondence, news from Manchester Township, reports of who visited whom and whose daughter got married and what the weather has been like and whether the crops look promising this year. You write under your married name, Mrs. Nathan Dow, and the pieces are published in the Smet News and the Euronight. Tiny paragraphs buried on the back pages that no one will remember a week after they are printed. The work pays almost nothing, a few cents per column inch, barely enough to cover the cost of the stamps you use to mail the submissions. But the money is not the point. The point is that you are creating something, putting words on paper that other people will read, leaving a mark however small on the world beyond the kitchen and the chicken coop and the garden rows. You write about the ordinary details of rural life, the Ladies' Aid Society meeting at Mrs. Johnson's house, the barn raising at the Peterson farm, the travelling preacher who held revival services in the schoolhouse. You write about the weather, that eternal subject of farm correspondence, the droughts and the rains and the hailstorms that destroy crops and the blizzards that bury the roads and make travel impossible. You write about visits from relatives and trips to town, and the small events that constitute news in a community where nothing much ever happens. Your writing is plain and factual, without ornamentation or literary ambition. You're not trying to be Laura, not trying to craft narratives that transform ordinary experience into something profound or meaningful. You're simply recording what is, bearing witness to the slow passage of time in a place where time moves differently than it does in cities, where seasons matter more than calendar dates, and the rhythm of planting and harvest governs everything. But even this small claim to identity, this tiny assertion that you exist beyond your roles as wife and daughter and sister, feels like rebellion. It feels like claiming space that you are not given permission to occupy, like saying that your observations matter, that the world you inhabit is worth documenting even if no one will remember it a generation from now. Nathan does not understand why you bother. Who cares about the Johnson barn raising, he asks when he sees you writing at the kitchen table after the supper dishes have been washed. Who reads that stuff? People do, you say, though you're not sure this is true. It matters to them. He shrugs and goes back to his newspaper, and you go back to your column. And the gap between you widens imperceptibly, another small distance added to all the others. You're 40 years old when the United States enters the Great War in April of 1917, and the war comes to Manchester in ways both dramatic and mundane, disrupting the rhythms of farm life even in this remote corner of South Dakota that seems impossibly far from the trenches of France. Young men from the township enlist or are drafted, disappearing into training camps and then into the vast machinery of war that consumes them and sometimes spits them back out damaged, in ways that are visible and invisible. Food becomes a patriotic duty. The government urges farmers to increase production to feed the troops overseas, to plant every available acre, to sacrifice and conserve so that the boys in uniform will have enough to eat. Wheat prices rise, which should be good news for farmers, but labour is scarce because the young men who used to work the harvest are gone, and machinery breaks down and cannot be replaced because the factories are making weapons instead of tractors. Nathan is too old to be drafted, which is a relief you do not speak aloud because relief at not losing your husband to war feels selfish, when other women are hanging gold stars in their windows to commemorate sons and brothers who will never come home. But the war affects your household anyway. Sugar is rationed. Coffee is expensive. The government asks women to observe meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays, to make do with less so that more can be sent to Europe, and you comply because this is your patriotic duty. Because small sacrifices at home are nothing compared to what the soldiers are enduring in the mud and blood of the Western Front. You knit socks and scarves for the troops, sitting by the kerosene lamp in the evenings after the dishes are done, your fingers moving in the rhythmic patterns that women have used for centuries to occupy their hands while their minds wander. The Ladies' Aid Society organises care package drives, collecting cigarettes and writing paper and tins of cookies to send to the boys overseas, and you contribute what you can, baking cookies with carefully hoarded sugar and butter, wrapping them in wax paper and packing them in tins that will travel thousands of miles to reach a soldier who may or may not still be alive by the time the package arrives. The war ends in November of 1918, and the news is greeted with cautious celebration in Manchester, church bells ringing and people gathering in the street to share the relief that the killing has finally stopped. But the relief is tempered by grief for the local boys who will not be coming back, by the knowledge that the world has changed in ways that are not yet fully understood, and by the influenza epidemic that sweeps through the country in the final months of the war and into 1919, killing more Americans than the war itself. The flu comes to Manchester in December of 1918. Families are quarantined, schools close, church services are cancelled. People wear gauze masks when they venture into town, and they eye each other with suspicion, wondering who might be carrying the invisible contagion. You and Nathan both contract it. A week of fever and aching muscles and a cough that feels like broken glass in your lungs, but you survive because you're relatively young and healthy and lucky. Ma survives it too, improbably, though she is 80 years old and frail, and should by all rights be among the dead. But others in the community are not so fortunate. The township loses 15 people in the space of 2 months, bodies buried quickly in the frozen ground, funerals held graveside because gathering indoors is too dangerous, and the fear of the flu lingers long after the epidemic has passed, a reminder that death does not always announce itself with fanfare, that it can arrive quietly and take indiscriminately, claiming the young and healthy as easily as the old and sick. The decade that follows the war is difficult in ways that have nothing to do with global conflict, and everything to do with the slow, grinding struggle of farm life in a region where nature is capricious and markets are unstable. Wheat prices collapse after the war, dropping from $2 a bushel to less than $1 as demand plummets and European farms begin producing again. The droughts that plagued the Dakotas in the 1880s return with a vengeance in the early 1920s, year after year of insufficient rain, crops withering in the fields, topsoil blowing away in dust clouds that darken the sky and make breathing difficult. Nathan's farm survives. Barely. Because he's conservative and cautious and has never borrowed more than he could repay. But many of your neighbours are not so lucky. Farms are foreclosed. Families pack up and leave, heading for cities or for states where the rain falls more reliably. The rural population of the township dwindles, schools consolidate, churches close. The world you have known all your life is slowly emptying out, and those who remain are the stubborn or the trapped, the people who cannot leave or who refuse to admit that staying might be a mistake. You are both, stubborn and trapped, committed to a place and a life that offers nothing but the grim satisfaction of endurance. Ma dies on a Sunday afternoon in April, and unlike Pa's death, which came with weeks of warning and the slow deterioration that allowed time for goodbyes, Ma's death is swift and unexpected, a sudden stopping that catches everyone unprepared. You're in Manchester when the telegram arrives. Carrie sends it. Her message brief because telegrams charge by the word and there is no money to waste on elaboration. Ma gone. Come home. Carrie. You show the telegram to Nathan. He nods and says, "I'll drive you," and within the hour you're in the wagon heading toward Smet, the 7 miles feeling impossibly long, your mind churning through the implications of those 2 words, Ma gone. You knew this was coming, of course. Ma is 84 years old, ancient by any measure, and she has been declining for years, her body shutting down one system at a time, her mind remaining sharp even as her flesh failed. But knowing something is inevitable is different from experiencing it, and the shock of the telegram sits in your chest like a stone, heavy and cold. The house on 3rd Street is quiet when you arrive. Carrie meets you at the door, and she looks exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, her face drawn. She went in her sleep, Carrie says. Mary found her this morning when she didn't come down for breakfast. You climb the stairs to Ma's bedroom, the same room where Pa died 22 years ago, and you find her lying in the bed with her hands folded across her chest, already arranged by the undertaker who has come and gone while you were travelling. She looks smaller in death than she did in life, as if dying has collapsed her inward, reducing her to the essential minimum. Her face is peaceful, the lines of pain and worry smoothed away, and you think that this is what people mean when they say someone looks like they are sleeping. Though of course she is not sleeping, she is dead, and the difference is absolute and irreversible. Mary is in her chair in the parlour, rocking slowly, her hands moving restlessly in her lap. She has been crying, her face blotched and swollen, and when you enter the room she turns toward you with an expression of such naked terror that it stops you in your tracks. "What will happen to me now?" Mary asks, and her voice is small and frightened. The voice of a child who has just realised that the adults who are supposed to protect her are gone. This is the question that no one has wanted to ask, the problem that has been looming for years but that everyone has avoided confronting. What happens to Mary when Ma is no longer here to care for her? Mary is 59 years old, blind, incapable of living independently, and she has no husband or children to take her in. Her options are limited and grim. Move in with one of her sisters, or go to a home for the blind, or somehow try to survive alone in a world that has no place for disabled women without family support. "You'll come stay with Carrie," you say, making the decision in the moment because someone has to decide and Carrie is standing right there, and you cannot offer to take Mary yourself, because Nathan would never agree to have your blind sister living in the small house in Manchester, and besides, Carrie is unmarried and has more space and more resources. Carrie does not contradict you, which you take as agreement, though you can see the resignation in her face, the acceptance of yet another burden, another responsibility that will limit her freedom and define her life for years to come. The funeral is held 3 days later, and it is smaller than Pa's funeral was, because Ma has outlived most of her friends and contemporaries, because the community has changed and many of the old families have left or died. The church is half empty. The minister gives a sermon about long life and faithfulness, and the rewards that await the righteous in heaven, and you sit in the front pew between Mary and Carrie, and you listen to the words wash over you without meaning. Laura has come this time, making the long trip from Missouri, and she sits beside you during the service, her presence both comforting and unsettling. She's 57 now, and she looks older than her years, weathered by farm life and poverty, and the strain of trying to make Rocky Ridge Farm profitable. But she's also becoming something else, something you cannot quite name. She's been writing columns for the Missouri Ruralist for over a decade, and she talks about maybe writing something longer someday. A book, perhaps, though she is vague about the details, and you cannot imagine who would want to read a book by Laura Ingalls Wilder, farm wife from the Ozarks. They bury Ma next to Pa in the Smet cemetery, and the grave is opened and the coffin is lowered and the minister speaks the words about ashes and dust, and then it is finished. Both parents gone. The original Ingalls household dissolved. The family home on 3rd Street now empty except for the furniture and the memories that cling to the walls like cobwebs. You return to Manchester the next day, and Carrie takes Mary to live with her in Smet, and Laura goes back to Missouri, and the 3 surviving Ingalls daughters scatter to their separate lives, connected by blood and history but no longer by daily proximity or shared purpose. You are 46 years old, and both your parents are dead and the childhood world you came from has officially ended. You are an orphan now, even at your age, and the knowledge sits in your chest alongside all the other losses you have accumulated, one more weight in a collection that grows heavier with each passing year. But the losses are not finished yet. There is more coming, more death, more grief, and you will be there to witness it because that is what you do. That is your role in this family. You stay, you witness, you survive. You're 51 years old when the telegram arrives from Carrie, and this time there is no surprise, no shock, only the weary acceptance of something you have been expecting for months, maybe years. Mary passed, pneumonia, funeral Thursday, Carrie. You fold the telegram carefully and place it on the kitchen table, and you sit down in the chair by the stove because your legs suddenly feel unreliable, as if they might give out beneath you. Nathan is in the barn, and you're alone in the house, and the silence feels different than it did 5 minutes ago, heavier somehow, weighted with the knowledge that another piece of your childhood has been erased, that the family you were born into is disappearing, person by person, death by death, and you cannot stop it. Mary Amelia Ingalls, born January 10th, 1865, died October 20th, 1928. 63 years old, blind for 49 of those years, never married, no children. A life spent in darkness, dependent on others, creating beauty with her hands that her eyes would never see, and now she is gone. And what is left to show for her existence? A few pieces of beadwork scattered among relatives' homes. some fading memories in the minds of people who are themselves growing old, a grave marker in the Smet cemetery that will outlast the memories by a century or more. You take the train to Smet the next day. The journey is familiar now, routine. This trip you have made dozens of times for births and deaths and holidays and emergencies. 7 miles that separate your married life from the family you were born into. The landscape rolls past the window, brown and dormant in the late October chill, and you watch it without really seeing it. Your mind caught in the past, replaying moments with Mary that you did not know were significant until they became the last moments. The funeral is small. Mary outlived most of the people who knew her as a young woman, and her blindness meant she never formed the kind of wide social circle that other women cultivate through church activities and community involvement. The mourners are mostly family. You and Nathan, Carrie, a handful of cousins who still live in the area. Laura has sent a telegram expressing her regrets that she cannot make the journey from Missouri, that the farm requires her presence, that she is sorry, so sorry, but she cannot come. You stand beside the grave as they lower Mary into the ground, and you think about the girl she was before the illness that took her sight, the golden-haired eldest daughter who was supposed to be the accomplished one, the successful one, the pride of the family. You think about how much she lost when she lost her vision, not just sight itself, but the future that had been planned for her, the teaching career she might have had, the husband and children who never materialized, the independent life that was stolen from her at 14 and never returned. But you also think about what Mary had, in some strange way that you cannot quite articulate. She had Pa and Ma's complete devotion in a way that the rest of you never experienced. She was the one they sacrificed for, the one they sent to college despite the cost, the one whose needs shaped every family decision for decades. She was central, important, mourned in advance even while she was still alive, and perhaps there is a kind of twisted privilege in that, a guarantee of mattering even if the price is dependence and limitation. The minister speaks about patience and suffering, and the reward that awaits the faithful in heaven, where Mary's blindness will be healed and she will finally see the faces of her loved ones and the beauty of creation. You listen to these words and you want to believe them, want to imagine Mary whole and happy in some afterlife where all wrongs are righted and all losses restored. But mostly you just feel tired and sad and aware that one more connection to the past has been severed, that the childhood world is receding further into history with each death. Carrie stands beside you at the graveside, and when the service ends and people begin to drift away, she turns to you and says, "I'm the oldest now." Her voice is flat, stating a fact, but underneath it you hear the weight of realization, the understanding that she is next in line, that time is moving in one direction only, and there is no reversing it. We're all getting old, you say, which is not comforting but is true. Laura's writing a book, Carrie says suddenly, the non sequitur jarring. She sent me a letter last month. She's working on something about our childhood in Wisconsin. She wants to know if I remember details about the big woods, about the cabin, about Grandpa and Grandma. You do not know how to respond to this. Laura has been talking about writing a book for years. Vague mentions in letters, dreams that never quite materialized into action. But perhaps now, with both parents dead and Mary gone, perhaps now she feels free to write about the past without worrying about who might be hurt or offended by her version of events. What did you tell her, you ask? I told her what I remember, Carrie says, which isn't much. I was too young. Most of my memories are from later, from Walnut Grove and Smet. You nod. Your own memories of early childhood are fragmented, unreliable, more impression than detail. You remember the dugout by Plum Creek, but you do not remember Burr Oak because you were an infant, do not remember Wisconsin because you were not born yet. Your story begins in the middle of the family's journey, and the beginning belongs to others. She'll probably want to talk to you too, Carrie says, about the Smet years. You remember more than I do. Maybe, you say, though you're not sure you want to be part of Laura's book, not sure you want your childhood examined and transformed into something for strangers to read. Some things should stay private, should remain in the realm of family memory rather than public consumption. But that choice, you will discover, is not really yours to make. You're 52 years old when the stock market crashes in October of 1929. And the collapse barely registers in Manchester because no one you know owns stocks. No one has money invested in the markets that are hemorrhaging wealth in New York City. No one has the kind of surplus capital that can be lost in a financial panic. But the depression that follows the crash, that is different. That touches everyone, even farm families in remote South Dakota townships who thought they were already living at the bottom of the economic ladder and had nowhere further to fall. You were wrong. There is always further to fall. Wheat prices dropped to 30 cents a bushel, which does not even cover the cost of seed and labour. Corn sells for 10 cents a bushel, if you can find a buyer at all, which mostly you cannot. The banks that hold farm mortgages begin foreclosing, taking land from families who have worked it for decades, selling it at auction for pennies on the dollar to buyers who do not exist because no one has money to buy farmland when farming does not pay. Nathan's farm survives because the mortgage was paid off years ago, because he owns the land outright and no bank can take it from him. But survival is not the same as prosperity, not even the same as adequacy. The farm produces food, potatoes and beans and corn and chickens and eggs. But food has no value when no one can afford to buy it. You eat what you grow because there is no alternative, and you are grateful for it even as you understand that you are trapped in a closed loop, producing only for your own consumption. Cut off from the cash economy that has collapsed around you, the government tries to help. There are programs with acronyms WPA, CCC, SA, that provide make-work jobs and subsidies for farmers who agree to plough under crops or slaughter livestock to reduce supply and drive up prices. Nathan takes the government money because turning it down would be stupid, but he resents the necessity, resents the implication that farmers cannot manage their own affairs without federal intervention, resents the young men from Washington who come around with clipboards explaining how agriculture should work to people who have been farming their entire lives. The drought returns in 1930, and it does not leave. Year after year of insufficient rain, the topsoil turning to powder and blowing away in clouds that darken the sky and seep into every crevice of the house, no matter how carefully you seal the windows and doors. You wake in the morning to find a fine layer of dust on the furniture, on the dishes in the cupboard, on the pillow beside your head. You taste it in your food. You feel it grit between your teeth. You cough it up from your lungs in thick brown phlegm that stains the handkerchiefs you wash and reuse because buying new ones is an unthinkable luxury. People leave. The exodus that began in the 1920s accelerates. Farm families packing their belongings into trucks and heading west to California, where the government has promised work and the rain supposedly still falls. The population of the township drops by half, then 2/3. Houses stand empty, windows broken, doors hanging open, gradually collapsing under the weight of neglect and weather. The school where you once taught closes because there are not enough children left to justify keeping it open. The church consolidates services, one minister serving multiple congregations, preaching in a different town each Sunday because no single community can support a full-time pastor anymore. You stay because leaving is not an option, because you are 55 years old and Nathan is 73, and starting over in California or anywhere else is a fantasy for young people, not for a couple who can barely manage the farm they already own. You stay because this is home, because the alternative is admitting that the last 30 years have been a waste, that all the work and sacrifice and endurance have led to nothing but the privilege of dying in the same place where you struggle to live. And in the middle of all this hardship, in the middle of the depression and the drought and the slow collapse of rural America, you receive a letter from Laura. She has written a book. It has been accepted for publication by Harper & Brothers, a real publishing house in New York. The book is called Little House in the Big Woods, and it is about her childhood in Wisconsin, about the family before you were born, about Pa and Ma and Mary and Carrie in the cabin in the forest. The book will be published in 1932, and Laura is excited, nervous, hopeful that it will sell, that people will want to read about pioneer life, that maybe there will be enough royalties to help with the farm expenses in Missouri. You write back with congratulations, because that is what sisters do, and you try to feel happy for her, try to ignore the small, petty voice in your head that whispers, "Why her?" Why does she get to be the one who escapes through words, who transforms poverty into stories that city people will buy, who makes something beautiful out of the suffering that crushed the rest of us? You do not listen to that voice. You fold the letter and put it away and go back to work. You are 55 years old when you first see yourself in one of Laura's books, and the experience is disorienting in a way you did not anticipate, like looking into a mirror and seeing someone who resembles you, but is not quite you. A version of yourself filtered through someone else's memory and imagination and narrative purpose. The book is By the Shores of Silver Lake, published in 1939, and it covers the period when the family moved to Dakota Territory, when you were a toddler, too young to remember but old enough to be present. A character in the story, even if you are not yet conscious of being part of a story. Laura sends you a copy with a letter, explaining that she has tried to be accurate, that she consulted her old notebooks and asked Carrie about details she could not remember, that she hopes you will not mind seeing your childhood self portrayed for strangers to read about. The letter is apologetic but also proud, and you understand that Laura is asking for your blessing retroactively, now that the book is already published and there is no changing it. You open the book and find yourself on the pages, described as a small child with golden curly hair, sweet-natured and beloved, the baby of the family who everyone doted on. You read about yourself as if you are reading about a stranger. Grace's hair was golden like Mary's had been, and her eyes were as blue as violets. Grace was growing so fast, and she was so pretty and good that Laura could hardly believe she was the same baby they had brought into the new country only a year ago. This is not how you remember yourself. You do not remember being pretty or good or particularly beloved. You remember being invisible, overlooked, the youngest child in a family that had too many worries to pay much attention to anyone who was not actively causing problems. But perhaps that is Laura's gift, the ability to take the raw material of experience and shape it into something that feels true, even if the facts are different, that captures an emotional reality, even if the details are adjusted. You keep reading. You appear throughout the book, a minor character, the little sister who plays quietly while the older sisters do important things, who is protected and sheltered and somehow exempt from the hardships that shaped Laura and Carrie and Mary. And you realise that this is how Laura sees you, how she has always seen you, as the one who was spared, the one who came along after the worst was over, the one who did not have to endure the full weight of pioneer suffering, because by the time you were old enough to remember, the family was established in Smet and the worst of the hunger and uncertainty was past. She's not entirely wrong. You were spared some things. You did not experience the year in Burr Oak consciously, did not live through the early Walnut Grove struggles, were too young during the hard winter to fully understand the danger. But you were not spared everything, and the assumption that you were, the implication that your life has been easier simply because you were born last, stings in a way you did not expect. You write to Laura thanking her for the book, telling her it is lovely, that you are honoured to be included, that you hope it sells well. You do not mention the dissonance between her version of your childhood and your own memories. You do not say that being portrayed as pretty and good feels like being erased, reduced to a two-dimensional character whose only function is to be sweet and decorative, while the real story happens around her. Laura's books do sell. Not spectacularly at first, but steadily, building an audience of children and parents who are hungry for stories about a simpler time, about families who persevered through hardship with courage and humour and faith. The books win awards. They appear in libraries and schools. Laura begins to receive fan mail from readers who love the Little House family and want to know more about what happened to Laura and Mary and Ma and Pa, and yes, even little Grace with her golden curly hair. You're famous now, in a strange, second-hand way. Not famous as yourself, as Grace Dow, farm wife and former teacher and newspaper correspondent from Manchester, South Dakota. Famous as a character in someone else's story as baby Grace, the youngest Ingalls daughter, frozen forever in childhood, preserved in print as the sweet little girl who will never age or change or become complicated. People in Smet mention the books when they see you. I read about you in Laura's book, they say, smiling as if sharing a secret. You are such a cute little thing. They do not ask about your adult life, about your marriage or your work or your own struggles. They only want to talk about the child you were, the character Laura created, as if that version of you is more real, more interesting, more worthy of attention than the middle-aged woman standing in front of them. You smile and thank them and say, yes, Laura's done a wonderful job with the books. And you excuse yourself and go home and look at yourself in the mirror and try to reconcile the golden-haired, cherished baby in the book with the 58-year-old woman with greying hair and work-roughened hands and a body that is beginning to fail in small but undeniable ways. Your feet hurt all the time now, a constant ache that you have learned to ignore but that makes walking difficult. You're thirsty constantly, drinking water by the gallon and never feeling satisfied. You have lost weight despite eating normally, your clothes hanging loose on a frame that is shrinking without explanation. You're tired, exhausted in a way that sleep does not fix, as if your body is running on empty and cannot refuel. You do not go to the doctor. Doctors cost money, and whatever is wrong with you is probably just age, just the natural process of wearing out that happens to everyone eventually. Besides, what would a doctor do? Tell you to rest more, work less, eat better, reduce stress. These are impossible prescriptions for a farm wife in the Depression. Advice that belongs to a world of leisure and resources that you do not inhabit. So you ignore the symptoms and keep working, and you read Laura's books when they arrive, and you watch yourself become immortalized as baby Grace, the forgotten sister who is remembered only as a child, and you wonder whether this is better or worse than being forgotten entirely. You're 63 years old, and your body is betraying you in ways that can no longer be ignored, in ways that whisper a truth you do not want to hear. You are dying, slowly but inevitably, from the inside out. The thirst is constant now, unquenchable, your mouth always dry no matter how much water you drink. You wake in the night with your throat burning, stumbling to the kitchen in the darkness to pump water from the sink and drink glass after glass that never satisfies, that runs through you like you're a sieve with holes too large to hold anything. The frequent urination that accompanies the thirst means you're up 4, 5, 6 times a night, and sleep becomes something you remember rather than something you experience, and the exhaustion builds day after day until you're moving through life in a fog of fatigue that no amount of rest can penetrate. You have lost 30 pounds in the last year. Your dresses hang on your frame like garments borrowed from a larger woman. Your wedding ring slides off your finger unless you curl your hand into a fist to keep it in place. Your face is gaunt, the cheekbones prominent, the eyes sunken into hollows that make you look ancient, skeletal, like something that is already halfway to the grave. Your feet have gone numb, a pins and needles sensation that never quite resolves, and sometimes when you walk you cannot feel the ground beneath you, cannot tell whether you are stepping on level floor or uneven earth until you stumble and catch yourself against the wall or the table, or whatever solid object is nearby. You have cuts on your feet that will not heal, small wounds that fester and ooze and refuse to close no matter how carefully you wash and bandage them. Nathan notices but does not comment. He is 79 years old now, too old himself to take on the burden of an invalid wife, too set in his ways to adjust to the possibility that you might need care rather than providing it. He watches you move slowly through the house, watches you wince when you stand or walk, watches you push food around your plate without eating, and he says nothing because acknowledging your illness would require action, would require decisions and changes and possibly doctors who cost money the farm cannot spare. You know what is wrong with you. You have known for months, maybe longer, because diabetes runs in the Ingalls family like a curse passed from generation to generation. Laura has it. Carrie has it. You have watched both your sisters manage the disease with careful diets and insulin injections when they can afford them, and the slow acceptance that their bodies are breaking down in ways that cannot be reversed, only managed, and even management requires resources and access to medical care that are not always available. But you have done nothing about it. You have not gone to Dr. Sherman in Smet, have not asked for a diagnosis or treatment, have not told anyone except Nathan and even him only obliquely, mentioning that you are tired, that you are not feeling quite yourself, minimizing the symptoms because admitting their severity would mean admitting that you are seriously ill, that you are facing something that cannot be fixed with rest or better nutrition or sheer force of will. It is 1941. The world is at war again. Though America has not yet entered, not officially, though everyone knows it is only a matter of time. Hitler has conquered most of Europe. Britain stands alone, battered by bombs but still fighting. The newspapers are filled with reports from the front lines, with photographs of destruction and suffering that make your own problems feel small and selfish by comparison. Young men from the township are enlisting, preparing for the war that everyone knows is coming, and you think about how strange it is that the world can be tearing itself apart while you're simply trying to make it through another day without collapsing. Laura's books continue to be published. The Long Winter came out last year. Little Town on the Prairie is scheduled for publication this fall, just weeks away. You have read the manuscript that Laura sent, asking for your input on details about Smet, about the school and the church and the people you both knew. You appear in this book too, older now, a teenager, still minor but present, still the sweet younger sister who never causes problems and never demands attention. You wrote back telling Laura that the details were accurate, that she had captured the feeling of the town during those years. You did not tell her that you are sick, that reading about your younger self feels like reading an obituary for someone who is not quite dead yet, that seeing yourself immortalized on the page while your actual body is failing creates a dissonance so profound it makes your head ache. Carrie writes occasionally from Rapid City, where she's living alone, managing her own diabetes, working when she can and resting when she must. Her letters are brief and factual, reports of symptoms and doctor visits, and the cost of insulin, the practical details of managing a chronic illness on a limited income. She does not ask how you are feeling because asking would require you to answer honestly, and honesty is not something your family traffics in, not when it comes to suffering. You are the last Ingalls daughter, still married, still living with a husband who is alive, if not exactly present. Laura has Almanzo, Carrie is alone, and you have Nathan, who sits in his chair by the stove and reads his newspaper, and exists in the same house without really sharing your life, and you are grateful for even this minimal companionship because the alternative is the loneliness that Carrie endures, and you do not think you could bear that. But mostly, you are just tired. Tired of hurting, tired of being thirsty, tired of pretending that you are fine when you're not fine, when you're dying by degrees and everyone knows it, but no one will say it out loud. November 10th, 1941, is a Monday, and it dawns cold and grey. The kind of South Dakota morning that promises snow before nightfall, the air sharp with the coming winter. You wake before dawn, as you always do, though waking is perhaps not the right word when you have barely slept, when the night was a series of brief, restless dozes punctuated by trips to the bathroom, and glasses of water that did not satisfy, and the restless ache of a body that has forgotten how to be comfortable. Nathan is still asleep beside you, his breathing deep and regular, and you envy him that. The ability to sleep soundly while you're trapped in this half state between waking and sleeping, never quite achieving either. You get out of bed slowly, carefully, because sudden movements make you dizzy now, make the room spin and your vision go dark at the edges. You dress in the clothes you laid out the night before, fumbling with buttons that your numb fingers cannot quite grip, pulling on stockings over feet that you cannot feel. You make your way downstairs, one hand on the wall for balance, each step requiring concentration and effort. In the kitchen, you light the stove, a task so familiar that your hands perform it without conscious thought, even though your body is failing. You fill the coffee pot and set it on the heat. You begin to prepare breakfast, eggs and bread, and the last of the bacon from the smokehouse. But halfway through, cracking the eggs into the pan, you have to sit down because the room is spinning and your legs will not hold you anymore, and you sit at the kitchen table with your head in your hands and wait for the dizziness to pass. It does not pass. The spinning intensifies, and with it comes a pressure in your chest, a tightness that makes breathing difficult, and you understand with sudden clarity that this is not just another bad morning, not just another episode of weakness that will resolve if you rest for a few minutes. This is something different, something worse, something final. You try to call for Nathan, but your voice comes out as a whisper, too soft to carry up the stairs to the bedroom where he's still sleeping. You try to stand, thinking you will go to him, but your legs collapse beneath you, and you find yourself on the floor, the cold wood pressing against your cheek, and you think this is undignified. This is not how you wanted it to end, lying on the kitchen floor like someone who has simply given up. But dignity is a luxury, and you have never had many of those. You lie there, and you wait, and the pain in your chest intensifies, and your breathing becomes shallow and rapid, and you think about all the things you will never do, all the conversations you will never have, all the tomorrows that will arrive without you. You think about Laura in Missouri, writing her books, transforming your shared childhood into stories that will outlive everyone who actually lived them. You think about Carrie in Rapid City, alone, managing her diabetes with a grim determination that has defined her entire life. You think about Mary and Ma and Pa, all gone now, waiting perhaps on the other side of whatever comes next, if anything comes next, if there is another side at all. You think about Nathan, who will find you here in a few minutes or a few hours when he comes downstairs for breakfast and discovers that his wife has died on the kitchen floor, and you hope he will not blame himself, will not spend his remaining years wondering if he could have done something differently, though you suspect he will barely grieve at all, will simply clean up the mess and arrange the funeral and continue on in the same steady, emotionless way he has lived for as long as you have known him. And then you stop thinking, because thinking requires consciousness, and consciousness is slipping away like water through your numb fingers, and there is only darkness and silence, and the absence of pain, which is perhaps the closest thing to peace you have felt in years. Grace Pearl Ingalls. Dow dies on November 10th, 1941, at age 64, in Manchester, South Dakota, of complications from diabetes. Her husband Nathan finds her at 6:47 in the morning when he comes downstairs and sees the cold stove and the half-prepared breakfast, and his wife's body on the floor. He stands there for a long moment, looking at her, and then he goes to the telephone and makes the necessary calls, his voice steady and unemotional, reporting the facts without embellishment. His wife is dead. Please send the undertaker. Yes, he is fine. No, he does not need company. Just send someone to collect the body. The funeral is held 3 days later. Nathan buries her in the Smet cemetery, in the plot near her parents and sister Mary, where the Ingalls family lies together in the South Dakota soil that defined their lives and now holds their bones. 37 days after Grace dies, Japanese planes attack Pearl Harbor, and America enters the war that Grace spent her final year watching approach. The news spreads through South Dakota like wildfire, and young men rush to recruiting offices, and the country mobilizes for a conflict that will reshape the world, and Grace Ingalls Dow is already buried and forgotten, her death a footnote in a story that was never really about her anyway. Laura receives the telegram about Grace's death while she's working on revisions for These Happy Golden Years, the book that will be published in 1943 and will complete the Little House series, the book that ends with Laura's marriage to Almanzo and the promise of a bright future on the Dakota prairie. She reads the telegram and she sits down at her writing desk and she stares at the pages in front of her, and she thinks about her baby sister, who appears in the books as a sweet child with golden curls, who never grew up on the page, who remains forever frozen in childhood, while the real Grace aged and struggled and died alone on a kitchen floor, in a house where no one will remember her. Laura does not attend the funeral. The distance is too great. The wartime travel restrictions too complex, the farm too demanding. She sends a telegram to Nathan expressing her condolences, and she writes a letter to Carrie, and she adds a note to her publisher explaining that there has been a death in the family, and the revisions might be delayed, but not by much, because the work must continue, and the books must be finished, and personal grief is something that happens in the margins of more important concerns. Carrie attends the funeral. She's 71 years old, struggling with her own diabetes, and she makes the trip from Rapid City to De Smet knowing it might be the last time she's physically capable of such a journey. She stands beside Grace's grave, and she thinks about the baby sister who was always there, always in the background, always doing the work that no one noticed or acknowledged. She thinks about how Grace stayed in De Smet when she and Laura left, how Grace cared for Ma and Mary when no one else would, how Grace married a man she did not love, because staying meant watching everyone die, and leaving meant abandoning the people who needed her. And Carrie thinks about herself, the middle sister, the one who also stayed longer than she should have, who also sacrificed her own life to care for Mary after Ma died, who also married late and childless and ended up alone. She thinks about how she and Grace were more alike than anyone realised, how they were both trapped by duty and obligation, and the weight of being Ingalls daughters in a family where the famous sister got to leave and write books, while the forgotten sisters stayed behind and did the work that kept everyone alive. But no one will write books about Carrie. No one will immortalise her in print or remember her sacrifices or care that she spent years caring. For a blind sister who never thanked her, years working low-paying jobs to send money home to parents who expected it, years living in the shadow of Laura's growing fame while her own accomplishments went unnoticed and unrecorded. The obituary for Grace Ingalls Dow appears in the Smet News on November 15, 1941, a brief paragraph buried on page 3 between the school lunch menu and an advertisement for war bonds. Mrs. Nathan Dow, 64, of Manchester, died Monday at her home. She was the sister of author Laura Ingalls Wilder. Services were held Thursday at the Methodist Church. Burial was in De Smet Cemetery. 22 words. That is what Grace's life amounts to in the public record. 22 words, and half of them are about her famous sister, as if the only thing worth noting about Grace Ingalls Dow is that she was related to someone who mattered. Nathan lives for another 9 years after Grace dies. He does not remarry. He sells the farm in 1944 and moves into a boarding house in De Smet, and he lives quietly and alone until he dies in 1950, and he is buried beside Grace in the cemetery, and their graves are marked with simple stones that give names and dates, and nothing else. No indication of who they were or how they lived, or whether their lives had meaning beyond the biological fact of their existence. The Little House books continue to sell. They become classics of children's literature, taught in schools, adapted for television, translated into dozens of languages. Grace Ingalls lives on as Baby Grace, the golden-haired younger sister, forever sweet and beloved and uncomplicated, a character who exists to be protected and cherished by the older sisters who are the real heroes of the story. And the real Grace, the woman who taught school and cared for her parents, and married a man she did not love and died alone on a kitchen floor, that Grace disappears into the silence that swallows most lives, most stories, most of the people who were never famous or important or interesting enough to be remembered. But she was not the only forgotten Ingalls sister. There was another, one who lived even longer in Laura's shadow, one who did even more of the thankless work, one who watched everyone die and was the last one standing, the final witness to the pioneer world that the Little House books made famous. Her name was Carrie. Carolyn Celestia Ingalls Swansea, born August 3rd, 1870, died June 2nd, 1946. And her story is darker than Grace's, more complicated, more deliberately erased from the narrative that Laura chose to tell, because Carrie knew too much. Carrie remembered the things that Laura wanted to forget. Carrie had to be written small, made forgettable, pushed to the margins of the story, because if Laura had told the truth about Carrie, she would have had to tell the truth about everything else, and that truth would have destroyed the mythology that made Laura Ingalls Wilder rich. But that is a story for another night. Dim your lights, close your eyes, and when you are ready, come back and hear the story of the middle sister, the one who was there for everything, who remembered what really happened, and who Laura made certain would never be able to tell her side of the story, because Carrie Ingalls kept a diary, and what she wrote there would shatter everything you thought you knew about the Little House family. Subscribe so you don't miss the story Laura never wanted you to hear.